Hello, and welcome to Chapter 10 of my TearRing Saga Champions of Utena low turn count playthrough. According to the plot, this is the first really big battle we have against the Empire of Canaan as we start to drive them out of Salia. There are also several recruitment events in this chapter, with 2 pairs of units that we need to worry about getting. What I'm doing first of all, though, is thinking about money. At the end of last chapter, I avoided having any money stolen by simply having no money to begin with. However, that leaves us quite short on funds, so I'm going to use our accumulated money bags on this chapter. Money bags are interesting items. If you use them on the map, you receive between 2,000 and 4,000 gold, randomly chosen. You can also sell them for a little over 2,000 gold, but using them on the battlefield generally gives you a higher expected value. I'm handing these out to units who won't have much to do on the first few turns. We're going to be using them all in order to get a little bit of money into Runan's coffers. In this map, we don't have to worry about crossing a desert, so Esther and Arcus are being deployed again over some of our weaker infantry units. Now, there are 2 groups of enemies on this map. One is up on the plains to the north, while the other is around the village that we are currently in. The objective here is seize, which is most easily done by going due east from the starting point, so you may think that the upper group is easily avoided, but we do have to deal with them for a certain reason. Anyway, I will come back to that. For now, we need to talk about the enemies that are surrounding us in the town. Our first pair of recruitable units is among these. They're the ones that just came out of the little house. Their names are Sharon and Billford, and we need to make sure that we don't accidentally kill them or let them kill us. Raffin needs to talk to Sharon in order to recruit her, and then she talks to Billford to recruit him. But unfortunately, Raffin cannot reach Sharon on turn 1, so we have to adopt this complicated defensive formation in order to keep Runan safe. Esther, fortunately, has just enough movement to move into a position where she can bait Sharon into attacking her without dying. Sharon is the only 2-range enemy in this group, so Esther is not in danger of dying, but she still takes quite a lot of damage, making her good bait to keep Sharon away from Raffin on this turn. Now we had better talk about the upper group, because I've sent Zieg up there to bait them out. The leader of this group is Ernst, and he's a very scary boss, but thankfully as soon as we get into range of any of his group, he leaves and we don't have to fight him now. Thank goodness, because I don't think we have any way to deal with him. It's his other named subordinate that we're interested in though. His name is Mince, and he is recruitable after this map if we get him over to the fortress that Runan needs to seize before Runan gets there. This is fairly simple to do in a normal playthrough, but since we're aiming for the lowest possible turn count, we have to get Mince moving as soon as possible in order for him to beat Runan there. Later on in the chapter, Mince's AI is going to change so that he goes directly to the seize point without being aggressive towards our units. But we can't wait for that to happen, and so we have to deal with him being aggressive already. Because of that, Zieg is going to have to keep a fair distance away from him while still being the closest unit to him, so that he moves in the right direction. Let's now turn back to the recruits in the lower part of the map. Sharon is now making her move, and she's been very annoying because she's decided to go all the way up above the house to attack Esther. In my testing, Sharon generally stayed right next to Raffin when she did this, which made recruiting her afterwards very easy. But in this circumstance, we have to worry about getting some enemies out of the way for Raffin to be able to reach Sharon. This also leaves space open for Billford to attack Raffin, who has an Armor Slayer equipped, which means that Billford is going to be eating a whole lot of damage here. Fortunately, Billford is bulky enough to survive this round of combat, and that's actually going to come in useful quite soon. We also see Raquel having just enough durability to survive a round of combat against an enemy with a Brave Lance, saving Runan from a round of combat that he has pretty much no way to survive short of extensive shield wastage. With the enemy phase concluded, we now need to worry about keeping our fragile units out of range of the surviving enemies, as well as removing the obstacles from Raffen reaching Sharon. To this end, we move Esther back to be healed, and then bring in Mariel with her powerful Starlight Tome to kill the enemy with a hammer who would otherwise pose a threat to Billford's survival. Now that Raffen is free to reach Sharon, let's have a talk about our new recruits. Sharon is more or less the same as Kate, except better in pretty much every way at this point. Kate is now more or less obsolete. In future scenarios where I want a foot unit with decent 2 range, I'm going to be choosing Sharon pretty much every time. However, beyond that, Sharon still isn't terribly good, and she's not going to be a long-term unit by any means. Similarly, Billford is an armor knight, and he's pretty much better in every way than Norton, the armor knight we already have. However, of course, armor knights still have 3 movement, and that means that Billford also is not going to be a long-term unit. Right now though, he does have one very useful property, and that is Wrath. This is why I wasn't too bothered by Raffen attacking Billford. All the damage he took simply boosted his critical rate by an absurd amount, making him extremely reliable at killing some of these enemies that we need to deal with here. Now, I mentioned when we recruited Norton that both the armor knights in this game have a way of growing out of their 3 movement, and Billford's way of doing this is a movement growth. Like in Thracia, some units in this game have movement growths, though unlike in Thracia, very few of them do. We already have one unit with a movement growth, that would be Mel, but it's so insignificant that I didn't bother mentioning it. Billford's movement growth is 5%, so he's not going to be growing too far out of his low move unless you are extremely lucky. And that's really all there is to say about the armored knights. Billford does also have Pavis at base, which is a useful but ultimately still luck-based durability boost. Moving on, you can see that I am using the blue flag markers to make sure that Zieg is not within Mince's range. This is pretty important, because Mince has a killer lance, and there is a chance that he can get a critical hit and just kill Zieg if he reaches him. And furthermore, more pressingly, because of Zieg's wrath, there is a big chance that he will get a crit and kill Mince instead, and neither of these is desirable. Mince actually has one more movement than Zieg as well, meaning it's very important to remember where his range is and keep well away from it. Zieg is now slaughtering his way through the remnants of Mince's men, and Runen is moving ever closer towards the seize point, so perhaps now is a good time to talk about how we're actually going to recruit Mince. This recruitment event is actually somewhat convoluted, with several ways that it can go based on what you do. As I mentioned, there is a second unit who can be recruited in the same event. Her name is Leonie, and she is currently a prisoner in the fortress. The first way that this recruitment event can go is that Mince fails to reach the fortress before turn 10. If that happens, Leonie is killed in a cutscene, and there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it. Though I believe we still recruit Mince if we allow him to reach the fortress after this happens. Since this is a full recruitment playthrough, we obviously do not want this to happen. The second possibility is if we reach the seize point before Mince does. In this case, we recruit Leonie, but Mince does not join us. So again, we want to recruit everyone, so this option is also not going to happen here. The third possibility is if we let Mince reach the seize point, and then we wait at least one turn afterwards. This leads to an extended event in which Mince frees Leonie, but gets thrown in prison himself. If this happens, we get the opportunity to recruit Leonie several chapters down the line, and we get Mince straight away. If this happened, it wouldn't be too big a deal, although it would require some finagling to get Leonie recruited when she next shows up. But the real problem here is that it's possible for Runen to reach the seize point immediately after Mince does, so waiting around that one extra turn means that we have lost a turn. So what we're going for here is option 4, where Mince reaches the seize point on his enemy phase, and then Runen immediately seizes the subsequent player phase. This means that we get to recruit both Mince and Leonie right now, although we won't see them in action until after an interval in which we control homes instead. I'll talk about them in more detail as units when that chapter rolls around. At the start of turn 4, Mince's AI finally changes, which is just as well because Runan and his group are now right within his range, and it would be very bad indeed if Mince decided to go for Runan and kill him here. One nice thing about this whole event is that Mince remains an enemy for the duration, even though he has non-aggressive AI, and that means he can move straight through the knot of enemies surrounding the seize point without worrying about being blocked, which is a rare luxury in movement-based objectives. I make a slight blunder here because it turns out that you can't canto after just trading in this game. We also now have to worry about the 2 enemies who Zeke failed to kill and who are now closing in on our scrub squad back at the start of the map. Fortunately, we have Raquel back there to help out, so I am able to scramble some units to take on these enemies' attacks and then deal with them on the subsequent player phase. We also need to wipe up the last remaining enemy in the lower area, which Muriel is going to do with her Starlight Tome. As we approach the fortress, I need to talk about one last wrinkle in Mince's recruitment. If any player unit gets within range of any of the units guarding this fortress, a cutscene occurs and the enemy boss comes out of the fortress. When this happens, Mince is programmed to immediately leave the map, never to return. This seemed to present an unavoidable turn cost for recruiting Mince, but fortunately MoogleBoss and Dondon151 were able to figure out a way around it. Among the enemies down there is a lone armored knight, and killing this armored knight in one round of combat prevents the event that summons the boss from ever happening. My hypothesis on why this is that I believe that this unit is meant to represent the generic person in the cutscene who alerts the boss to the arrival of Runan's forces. So obviously killing him means he cannot alert the boss, and thus the boss cannot come out and force Mince to leave the map. Whatever the intended reason for this little quirk, I am very grateful that it's there, because it means that we don't have to worry about losing a turn to get Mince. At the end of this enemy phase, Kate starts dealing with one of the remaining enemies, and the other one runs directly into the jaws of our group. I did end up accidentally blocking Mince from using his full movement on this turn, but he has so much move that it's really not a problem. He's still going to get there just in time. And now we see Zieg moving in to attack the armored knight and killing him, and thankfully no cutscene happens and Mince remains on the map. I had intended to use Raffin here with the Armor Slayer, but I failed because of my blunder with Kanto that I mentioned earlier. And then I do something that I also did on the previous map but didn't comment on. Runan trades with the convoy while he is on the map to put away his steel shield that I don't want to waste. The Lord having access to the convoy while on the map is a common thing in modern Fire Emblem, and isn't something that I had thought to comment on last chapter. But it bears pointing out that this is in fact the first game in the series that has this functionality assigned to the Lord. Fire Emblem didn't start doing that until the Sacred Stones, which released several years later. And even the Blinding Blade, which was the first Fire Emblem game to have convoy access tied to a unit rather than to a special tile, was released several months after this game. Now, Plum has just entered a house, the same house that Sharon and Billford initially came out of, and she's vanished from the map now. This is the start of her event to make her into the really useful unit that she becomes, and we will be seeing her again partway through the next group of chapters. There is one more open house in the lower left part of the map that I have not yet visited, and in fact I'm not going to. If you go into this house, you will have the option to buy a Wyvern Flute, which is a promotion item for Pegasus Knights. The asking price here, however, is very steep. It is 10,000 gold, which I simply do not have spare at this point in the game. Furthermore, there's a good reason not to promote your Pegasus Knights in this game, and that is that they lose 6 magic if they promote. Since Martel is primarily using Levin swords, and I don't have Sasha, I have no real use for this Wyvern Flute, and in fact I don't end up getting the other Wyvern Flute in the game either. On this enemy phase, Zieg is going to tidy up a fair amount of the remaining enemies on this map, and this is actually why I would have preferred to use Raffen to kill the Armored Knight, because he needs experience as well, and Zieg already has really good stats. However, I'm not overly bothered by this, because more stats on Zieg at this point is still a help in an upcoming chapter, and Raffen did manage to get some combat that was meant to be Zieg's in the last chapter too. Besides, Raffen is now perfectly capable of moving in and helping Zieg tidy up the last scattered remnants of the defensive army. Runen has gone around the other side of the fortress to avoid being blocked off by any of these enemies and forcing me to find ways to kill them all. With that done, both Runen and Minz are now poised to enter the fortress gate and end the map. Now here's a slightly embarrassing story. I've already alluded a couple of times to a previous run of this game that I did, and that is not actually in reference to my old LTC attempt, which was far too long ago for me to remember such intricate details about how I handled the maps. It was actually a previous attempt at this run in which I made an assumption about how Minz's recruitment worked that turned out not to be true. So what happened was, instead of baiting Minz over earlier in the map and allowing him to enter the fortress first, I simply had Runen seize while Minz was still on the map. Because the next block of maps is Holmes's route, I had no way of realizing that I hadn't managed to recruit Minz until I'd beaten all the way through to the end of chapter 16, which is a pretty significant chunk of the game. Once I got there, I did have a little bit of a breakdown, but eventually I picked myself up and set to work re-recording the entire first part of the run, which is what you are now watching. So keep that in mind. If you want to recruit Minz, he has to enter the fortress before Runen. Don't make my mistakes. Anyway, as we have let Minz enter the fortress, it is safe for us to seize with Runen and complete the chapter in 7 turns. For some reason, these next few cutscenes were unskippable, so I have to go through them the long way. These are all support boosting events, but the important one is the last one that shows up, and that is where we get our first promotion of the game. Sharon and Raffen have a little talk, and then Raffen promotes into a Wyvern Knight. Stat-wise, this promotion doesn't look very impressive, because promotion in this game simply changes the class bases of the unit, and Wyvern Knight shares its class bases between the male and female versions, with the female version being a tier 2 class like the class that Raffen is already in. However, it still provides decent boosts to the stats that Raffen wants most, and it also allows him to fly, which is an extremely useful boon in many maps. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in the last video, the next few maps on Runen's route are very hostile to flyers, but Runen is generally strong enough that we have ways to get around that. Unlike female Wyvern Knights, Raffen's Wyvern Knight class keeps the property of Bronze Paladins that allows him to use lancers while dismounted. Incidentally, this promotion is a big part of why I consider Raffen to be better even than early promoted Naron, because Naron is never going to be able to fly. Anyway, after the end of this chapter, we move over on the world map back to Azura, where we take control of Holmes for the first time, and the next few maps are going to be following him and his band of adventurers. With that said, I will see you all next time.